Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from the Frontier, and thank you for stopping by. First of all, let me start with my home thoughts. I had a lovely time in Lewa at the Safaricom Marathon. It's really tremendous and very well organised. I'll put up a photograph of the starting line very early in the morning before any of the runners had actually got there. And then the next photograph I'll put up is a selfie with the oldest competitor, 84 years old, who completed the 21-kilometre run. And pretty extraordinary. I mean, he was totally self-aware, and had a little chat with him. I'd gone up there to do some film work for Jaguar and Land Rover, and we took this photograph in what Sanjeev described as the most atypical place for such a Jaguar, and called it Jaguar in the Jungle, and to see what you think. Anyway, I will be putting up that footage hopefully quite soon. It's quite fun. We then went on a game drive, saw these two incredible male rhinos on the hill, and it really was quite a sight, I must admit. And then early in the morning before I left, which was yesterday, I took this photograph of the sunrise just beyond my tent. And finally, I'll put up a photograph of Hannah in the waiting room at the airport. It really is lovely, and I love going from Bulson Airport in Nairobi because you go to these very exotic places like Lewa, which are so beautiful, I must admit. Political reflections as China flexes muscle, Obama frets over rivals' weakness. China is tailgating Japanese warplanes, playing chicken with Vietnamese ships, questioning America's toughness, yet it isn't Chinese strength that most worries President Obama. It's Chinese fragility. While Americans stew over the prospect of being eclipsed by a new superpower, their president frets about instability in the world's second largest economy. We welcome China's peaceful rise, Obama said in a recent NPR interview. In many ways, it would be a bigger national security problem for us if China started falling apart at the seams. Though no one expects this to happen anytime soon, if ever, Chinese President Xi Jinping confronts an array of potential triggers for unrest. After more than 3 decades of growth that has raised per capita income no more to more than 17 times its 1978 level. Wow. And I suppose that's the evidence of the rise. China's breakneck change is only intensifying, undertaking massive transformations necessary for modern society, but in every case are socially destabilizing. And they're doing every one of them at a pace, scope and scale no country has ever tried before. Saying the US has a great deal riding on the outcome, China is the single largest holder of US debt with $1.3 trillion in treasury securities. Sino-US trade topped $562 billion, up 38% from 5 years earlier. And then somebody painting a very extreme scenario, saying major turmoil could spark massive refugee flows, or even endanger control of China's estimated 250 nuclear warheads. That's a little bit extreme. And as he said, that's a future you want, you don't, that's not a future you want to contemplate. I think it's unlikely. Since 2004, China's urban numbers have grown by about 200 million, akin to the population of Brazil. By 2030, China will have 1 billion city dwellers, up from 731 million today, according to the World Bank. Since the 1989 Tiananmen protests, China's Communist Party has preserved social stability with a mixture of economic growth and authoritarian muscle. The foundation of public order is an implicit bargain. The party retains its monopoly on power in return for providing an ever better standard of living. Indeed, saying the bargain is now under pressure. 60 people were arrested last month after protests against a proposed waste incinerator turned violent. A lot of the stability in China is growth dependent, so the Communist Party's legitimacy base is rather narrow, so someone else. The probability of instability increases fairly substantially when growth slows down. Indeed, that's a fact. Then going back to saying earlier this month, China's bravado bubbled over at a regional security conference in Singapore. Major General Zhu Chenghu, a professor at China's National Defense University, warned US allies and Asia not to count on a strong American presence in the region, likening the US response to the Ukraine crisis to erectile dysfunction. Sun Liping, a professor at Tsinghua University, estimated 3 years ago there had been 180,000 protests, strikes, riots, and other mass incidents in 2010, twice as many as 2006. They face some very serious social order challenges, said a senior research scientist, and some of them appear to be getting worse. I think the US-China relationship is now fundamentally adversarial, and that the US appreciates that it has a hard power leading edge that is eroding over time. And my view is that when you have a decisive advantage, you tend to press it. And I think the US establishment see it in that way. And that's why I wrote on the 2nd of December 2013 about how the pivot to Asia was bearing its fangs. That was when China announced the ADIZ, and we had that dramatic situation where B-52s were flown into it. Now moving to Baghdad, he is the Imam and Caliph for all the Muslims everywhere, the group's spokesman Abu Muhammad al-Adnani said. It's good to know. The group, previously known as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, and also known as ISIS, has renamed itself Islamic State IS. And that's interesting, ISIL, ISIS, and IS, and proclaimed its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as Caliph, the head of the state, the statement said. And whilst I accept these are my conclusions, that it's fluid, and certainly the Islamic States, the IS, their lightning strike across Iraq was breathtaking and effective, but I don't think we can expect many further gains. Baghdad is a different ballgame altogether, as I said last week. The claim that Baghdadi is now the Caliph will give some GCC patrons food for thought, I'm sure, but I think the risks are all skewed to major fragmentation across the Middle East, and this was referred to by Naftali Bennett on the radio, and I couldn't find his words, but he was essentially saying that, the military might of Israel gives it an enormous power in the region when he calls it, you have just pockets of terrorism everywhere, is how he described it. But what he was referring to is fragmentation, and I think that is now inevitable. And then Coburn is saying what I think ISIS or IS may be unable to capture the capital, which is a population of 7 million, the majority are Shia. And then another piece in The Guardian saying we have Asaib al-Haq on the other, I don't know who to be more scared of, and Asaib al-Haq is the most powerful Shia militia in Iraq. It's a direct proxy of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Asaib is untouchable in Baghdad and feared around the country, and I think essentially they draw the red line in Baghdad. The statement, of course, declared Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the Caliph, or head of the Caliphate. Previously in 2009, apparently it said, "I'll see you guys in New York," were his parting words to US troops in 2009. He was also known as Dr. Ibrahim or Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim Ali al-Badri al-Samurai, and he's now apparently the Caliph of all Muslims. According to somebody, there hasn't been a Caliph since the Ottoman Empire outside of the Ahmadiyya sect of Islam, and the Caliph is appointed as the only legitimate successor to Prophet Muhammad. The fact that ISIS or IS has done this has huge ideological and theological implications, and is a big challenge to al-Qaeda. Their spokespeople may well try to reclaim their legitimacy. And then that takes me back to the hanging by the neck of Saddam Hussein, whose final words were, when he's told, go to hellfire, somebody shouts at him, you're going to hell, and he replies, and it's a mocking question, to hell. Several individuals say several times, to hell, hellfire, go to hell. Saddam Hussein mockingly replies and asks, to the hell that is Iraq, exclamation mark. And then I came across this on Global Research. Notice the spotless white athletic shoes, hardly combat ready, or perhaps those of actors. Where are they really from? And Netanyahu is saying we should support the Kurdish aspiration for independence. He's calling them a nation of fighters who have proved political commitment and are worthy of independence. WHO is saying there are 635 cases of hemorrhagic fever, most confirmed to be Ebola, and that is making this outbreak the largest ever in terms of the number of cases and deaths, as well as geographical spread. As of Sunday, there were 635 cases, including 390 deaths, which have been reported across Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Moving on to the markets, interesting quarter we've had. Looking back, emerging market stocks rose, and it has had its best quarterly advance since September 2012. South Korean won has hit a 6-year high. Emerging markets rallied. That index rallied 5.6% since the end of March. The S&P, one trading day away from completing the longest stretch of quarterly gains in 16 years. Crude oil came off a little bit over the weekend. Some of the risk premium easing off. However, I think that could pop big time at any moment. The Brent index is up 3.4% in June. It's third straight monthly advance, just as a guide. South Korean won, of course, is at 2008 highs. Currency markets, euro 136.43. Dollar index much softer, 80.03. Japanese yen 101.31. Swiss franc 0.89115. Pound 170.27. I think that's going to 173.50. The Aussie 0.94258. Indian rupee has softened a little bit, and that's mainly because of the higher oil price. It's down 1.6% this month. South Korean won 1014.4, but as I said, that recently hit 2008 highs. Rial 219.54. All those worries about the World Cup and how they weren't able to get on top of it seem to have been allayed. Egyptian pound 715.85 and the rand 1057.75. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index, and it really has traded soft. But having said that, bear in mind what I heard when I was in Milan, when this author Calamaris and a few other people agreed with him, felt that the benign forward outlook that the Fed was imagining for inflation was unlikely to play out, and that once you saw much higher prints on the inflation rate, the Fed would be forced to raise rates more aggressively, strengthening the dollar. But there's no sign of that yet. Euro dollar 136.43. Gold 1316.43. I think it's pretty toppy around here. Crude oil softened a little bit, 105.44. I think it's a trading buy if you can snap it up around 105. South Korean won, I'll put up a 1-year chart. That's up 5.2% in the last quarter, Q2 2014. And a pretty smart performance. Zambia's president's Israel trip may include medical care, said the vice president. He may be receiving medical care while on vacation in Israel, Vice President Guy Scott said after being questioned for the second time in 3 days about the leader's health. It's a holiday. Is there some medical tourism put in? I presume, Scott told lawmakers today in Lusaka, the capital of Africa's second biggest copper producer. The South African all shares up 9.445% in 2014, not far off a record. Dollar versus rand improving, 1057.75 last. The Egyptian pound 715.03. Egyptian stock market up 18.991% in 2014, still above the key 8,000 level. Egypt Sisi detoured to Sudan after his Africa terrorism warning. Landed in Sudan on Friday for a lightning visit, which an analyst said would attempt to shore up a regional alliance against Islamic terrorism. Sisi was on a short visit for talks with President Omar al-Bashir. The two presidents held talks at the guest house on bilateral relations and issues of mutual concern. And clearly, I think Egypt might be sort of putting out a carrot and trying to draw Sudan into a situation and promising them that they can sort of help them navigate what are very tricky times at the moment for Sudan. Nigerian all share up 2.076% this year at 52-week plus highs. However, on the other side, on Friday, police said they defused a massive car bomb packed with 13 explosive devices outside the main mosque in Kano. We detonated a dangerous device that could have pulled down buildings. What happened in the Abuja explosion would have been child's play if these discovered explosives had exploded at the mosque. And then there's another report of 20 men in a Toyota pickup truck and motorcycles rolled into town, sprayed it with bullets, focusing much of their firepower on panicked worshippers in a local church. The Ghana Stock Exchange is up 9.6713%. Trouble in paradise as Seychelles' economy shrinks. Sun-kissed beaches and crystal clear seas are no longer enough to guarantee growth for Seychelles' economy. GDP declined the most in 4 years, dropping 2.9% in the first quarter compared with the previous 3 months. European tourists stayed away and tuna catches dropped. That was the first contraction in a year. Tourism makes up a quarter of the economy, employs 25% of the workforce in the nation, 90,000 people. Accommodation, food services contracted 5.5% in the quarter. Fishing shrank 17.9%. Manufacturing, beverages and tobacco fell 14.7%. Tuna fishing and processing accounts for almost 5% of GDP, 7% of jobs. And it seems to be correlated to softness in Europe. Rothschild Fund turns focus to Africa. Edmund de Rothschild has amassed $530 million for his first private equity fund, focusing on deals in Africa and the latest sign of investors' growing interest in the continent. The fund will be managed by Amethyst, a company majority owned by the Swiss private banking group and founded by Luc Rigourzeau and Laurent Demy, two former top executives at French development financial institution Proparca. I like this comment. Time counts in Africa. You can get much better returns if you stay longer. Coming to Kenya, Kenya's future clouds as tensions rise and tourists flee. This is Jeffrey Gettleman. The line at the water tank in the Kibera slum is not as long as it used to be. It's not because of a sudden advent of indoor plumbing. It's because fewer people can afford a 10-cent jerry can of water. The cost of just about everything here is going up. Rice, wood, rent, gas, minibuses. Hundreds of thousands of young men remain jobless, marooned in the muddy slums, selling garbage or hunting for casual work. And their ranks are growing only because a pillar of Kenya's economy, tourism, has been walloped by a wave of terrorist attacks, including a brazen raid on a coastal village last week that killed more than 40 people. And that's what I was writing about tourism actually over the weekend, but I haven't had it, so I'll read it out tomorrow, if you don't mind. Adding to the woes are rising political tensions, with critics accusing the government of trying to snuff out dissent and Kenya's opposition leaders threatening to stage nationwide protests. I'm not talking small protests, Raila Odinga said, his eyes glowing. I'm talking massive. On Friday, Odinga held a rally in the stadium in the western town of Eldoret. Scores of riot officers in helmets and camouflage fatigues ring the stadium. Glass towers rising across Nairobi, many financed by investors in Europe and the Middle East. Chugging bulldozers have become nearly as commonplace as minibuses. There are new roads everywhere, new bridges and huge malls being dug out of hillsides. Just this month, Kenya issued its Africa's biggest debut Eurobond, and saying at 51 years old, Kenya is a bit like a classic car, beautiful on the outside, nice to look at, but under the hood, many Kenyans say the wiring and especially the steering needs serious work. There is a pretty big bifurcation right now, I said. The capital markets are showing that they can look through a lot of this noise, but there's a great divergence between the markets and how people feel on the ground. It worries me, I said. Then one reason for the market's confidence in Kenya is its diversified economy, not a commodity country like Nigeria, Ghana with their oil, or Zambia with the metal, agriculture, horticulture, tourism, new discoveries of oil and gas, expanding service sector, far-reaching national airline, major African airport, and a second one under construction. Kenya's ruling party prides itself on its commitment to infrastructure. While the terrorist attacks are troubling, investors say Kenya's track record of business development and the size of its middle class indicate years of growth. Kenya is exceptional, said Josh Ruxin, an American who's written about entrepreneurship in Africa and is investing in a multi-million-dollar pharmacy chain with plans to open more than 100 Dwayne Reed-like stores across Kenya. biggest concern remains governance, and it is not only the recent moves by President Kenyatta's administration to solidify control, threatening to pass a punitive news media bill and to start a nationwide neighborhood watch program that critics say is tantamount to an internal spy network. It is Kenya's entire system which can best be described as an ethnocracy. It is a democracy, but politics are determined exclusively along ethnic lines and are often highly polarizing. People vote for members of their own group. Everybody knows the Interior Minister is an embarrassment, but the government can't fire him because he's Maasai, and they need a Maasai, said Boniface Mwangi. Tribal arithmetic can be explosive, as we saw in 2008, saying not since then have Kenyans been so worried about the direction of the country. Public safety seems to be deteriorating rapidly, and talking about hyena unearthing 4 bodies in secret graves, 5 workers bludgeoned to death at a gas station, then talk about Pekatoni, 2 truckloads of militants roared into the coastal village with black flags, black scarves, AK-47s, bazookas, grenades and illumination flares. They shot dozens of people, slit throats and burned down a good chunk of the town. It seemed more akin to an insurgency. Though the Shabab militant group from Somalia claimed responsibility, Mr. Kenyatta blamed local political networks. On Wednesday, his police services arrested the governor of the area in connection with murder. All of this raises the question of how much more a business community, however talented, can accomplish in a place that is increasingly insecure. African terrorist groups seem to have suddenly realized how vulnerable many states are at their core. Nigeria, as a cautionary tale, boasts one of the fastest growing economies on the continent, but at the same time Boko Haram is growing even faster. Nearly every week it stages bold attacks, including the kidnapping of more than 200 girls. Still missing, but if Nigeria produces nearly 2 million barrels of crude oil per day, it does not live or die on outside investment. Mr. Odinga, the opposition leader who lost in Kenya's last presidential election, remains the most potent shaper of the rising discontent. He holds no official government position, dismissed as many by as having no clear plan, 69. Still, he can instantly stir up the passions and loyalty of millions of fellow Luos, among others. In a recent interview at a hotel cafe, while slurping the froth off a cappuccino and snacking on peanuts, he said the people were fed up, so much so that they're willing to take the bullet. And you, he was asked. Mr. Odinga tossed a few more peanuts into his mouth, paused, chewed, and then grunted yes. Pretty aggressive talk from him. But I put a photograph of a resident of Kibera, the largest slum in Nairobi, in front of a poster of Raila Odinga. I think for now he's not offering everything, but as Jeffrey is saying in that article, he is the lightning rod, the flashpoint. It's where all the discontent is going to coalesce, and he's trying to sort of spread his tent as wide as he can. And I think there's a lot of concern about the 7/7 proposal to hold some rallies on the 7th of July. Linku, the Cabinet Interior Secretary, alleges that it's a gang plot to unleash chaos, and I'm not sure about this theory. I think plays into the Linku narrative, but I'm not sure that it's actually the correct one. I think as Al-Shabaab said, this is the first time regarding Pekatoni when we've taken responsibility, and a government said no, it's not you. In point of fact, it's quite unusual. Well, completely. Kenya shilling was lost at 87.52. Nairobi all shares up 9.542% this year. NSE 20 is down 1.867% this year. Mumia Sugar says they're in talks with 7 banks to restructure about 5 billion shillings of debt. I'll put up a link for their share price data. Citigroup sees Kenya Airways' valuation at the bourse rising. They think a fair price is 15 shillings and 50 cents, and I think that's absolutely correct. I'll put up a link for the Kenya Airways share price and full year results data. We will have the interviews with Titus and Alex Bugwa, the CFO, up later today. And UAP Holdings is set to invest 4.3 billion shillings in a real estate project in Kigali. Could see a lot more of that. Kigali is a very safe place, and I think it will prove very attractive if Nairobi continues to see these levels of insecurity, to particularly the big nationals and even the UN agencies, which constitute such a big part of Nairobi's economy. Nairobi constitutes such a big part of Kenya's economy. Once again, thank you for stopping by.